The Recollection of Forms of Spirit in James Joyce Finnegans Wake. Part 2. What clashes here of wills gain wants. So, continuing. In addition to the matter of the wake's content, the content philosophy is mediated by its own history as a condition of its possibility, in Hegel's view. What the text is saying, and which requires some deciphering, there can be no interchangeable method because method always entails a content. One cannot separate the method of science, for instance, from its content. And of its form, the manner by which such content is organized, although in virtue of their intrinsic relationship, they cannot in practice be completely disconnected from one another. The text is approached as an immense semantic riddle, a gargantuan word game. This is the Wake I'm talking about, by the way, not Hegel. The clues to which are there to be uncovered and decoded. Now, form and content can't be completely disconnected from one another, yes. Hegel endeavored to justify the need for a continued study of the classics in their own language. However much they are deemed irrelevant and obsolete, for the riches of ancient literature can only be enjoyed in their original language. As he says in an early work on classical studies, their content can be approximately given us by translation, but not their form, not their ethereal soul. Hegel's objection to translations is that in such copies, the contrast between the content and the form that has not grown up with the content makes itself felt unmistakably. So the Wake's content is dynamic, the text is brimming over with associations operating through the compacting of thousands of allusions, etymological obscurities, idiosyncratic phrasings, hermeneutic complexities. There is an amassing of layer upon layer of a multitude of conventional meanings destabilized. In addition, the faculty of imagination that generated the content is closely associated with recollection. Through its operations, desires and their functions are associated with physical existence, aspirations and expectations. Feelings and longings, fantasies and motivations are associated with spiritual existence, two modes of being in a continual and dynamic dialectical relationship. And the reader is responsible for the content's dynamism too, contributing to the meaning of the content through his or her unique and metastable, that just means always changing, interpretative activity. Right, the Wake's content is dynamic. The Wake's content is dynamic, and this is a very important point, and were we to attempt to make it fit within a static mode of understanding, then dialectic, even could we know it to be occurring, is not so much at risk of grinding to a halt, but rather it would make no sense at all. Such a mode of understanding Hegel terms picture thinking, although the actual word in German, actually I forgot to mention this, yes, Lucan of Samosata, wrote a satire concerning a book buyer who stocks his library full of books, never reads them, and thinks by having the inert objects there he will somehow possess the knowledge which is something actively dynamic that is contained in those books. Right, Vorstellung, picture thinking as it's translated. Also translated as representation. It is not imagination. Imagination features as one of the stages of recollection, but it is not picture thinking. Picture thinking cannot fully comprehend the workings of contradiction, nor of negativity, nor of mediation. All the key Hegelian ideas, in fact, intuitions are singular things, this and this and this. Concepts are universals, and between the two is Vorstellungen. There is an element of representation with Vorstellung, but it is not present in the way an intuition is. My laptop is in front of me, whereas Vorstellungen are interiorized, set before the mind with sensuous content or form, representing a transitional stage between intuitions and concepts. They are what we do most of our thinking with, together with the exercise of understanding. But as for a literary text, that is all Vorstellung. The sensuous content is easy to comprehend. I can turn away and picture my laptop in my mind, but there is also sensuous form. What it lacks is dialectical moments. Concepts do not turn into their opposites. They do not dynamically transform themselves through dialectic. It lacks the idea of necessary connection. The form of physical content is conceptual, and that of the wake is picture thinking. Vorstellung operates with internalized images drawn from sensuous experience, or ideas drawn from thought, though they are given an isolated status connected to the and. This happens, and then this happens. Human beings exist and think through concepts alone, but are in need of intuitions, bodily experiences, imagination. The truth is experienced through them. Picture thinking is crucial, but philosophy itself is not composed of particular pictures, however much they may seize the attention. So picture thinking, in contrast to conceptual thinking. The purer the notion itself is, the sillier an idea it becomes, when its content is in the form, not of the notion, but of picture thinking. And while there may be many ways of conducting picture thinking, to become wrapped up in it renders the apprehension of precisely what is going on as something of a problem. Though one may sense that something is amiss, nor can the necessity for a transition from picture thinking to conceptual thinking be properly understood. The latter seemingly lacking in vigour. So I have a quotation from The Science of Logic there. It is only after profounder acquaintance with the other sciences that logic ceases to be, for subjective spirit, a merely abstract universal, and reveals itself as the universal which embraces within itself the wealth of the particular, just as the same proverb in the mouth of a youth who understands it quite well does not possess the wide range of meaning which it has in mind of a man with the experiences of a lifetime behind him, for whom the meaning is expressed in all its power. The system is the realm of shadows, the world of simple essentialities, freed from all sensuous concreteness. And yet the rigour will become apparent through a total immersion in the systematic procedure in the process of its development. So, an example of how engaging in picture thinking leads to a philosopher barely knowing what he is about is that provided by a philosophical tradition that regards recollection or memory as a kind of seeing into the past. As far as we know, the notion of memory is a kind of perception, first occurs in Plato's Theaetetus. It recurs centuries later in David Hume's treatise on human nature, wherein memory is presented as the return of a visual impression, though less intense. The presupposition is that remembering involves the having of images, which is phenomenologically false. Any analysis that is concerned with memory and the language of the Wake should take note of Wittgenstein's observation concerning memory image and memory words, which I've repeated there. Oh well, memory, I see us still sitting at the table, but have I really the same visual image or one of those I had then? Do I also certainly see the table and my friend from the same point of view as then, and so not see myself? My memory image is not evidence for that past situation, like a photograph which is taken then, and convinces me now that this was how things were then. The memory image and memory words stand on the same level. That is from Wittgenstein's Zettel. In its account of recollection, images follow in the wake of the words, in the wake, and not vice versa. There's a quote from Finnegans Wake there. If I must read it. Finisher only a photograph of a yestern scene. Right. Indeed, anyone conducting a philosophical discourse at the level of picture thinking barely knows what they are about. As Hegel illustrates through a rather singular analogy, the depth which spirit brings forth from within, but only as far as its picture thinking consciousness where it lets it remain, and the ignorance of the consciousness about what it is really saying are the same conjunction of the high and the low, which in the living being nature naively expresses when it combines the organ of its highest fulfillment, the organ of generation, with the organ of urination. The infinite judgment qua infinite would be the fulfillment of life that comprehends itself, the consciousness of the infinite judgment that remains at the level of picture thinking behaves as urination. That's from observation of the relation of self-consciousness to its immediate actuality, from the Phenomenology of Spirit, and is not a very good translation, as I will explain. A very curious translation. It appears as organ of generation, in fact, in all the translations of the Phenomenology I've seen. English puritanism, I suppose, or prudery. Yes, because how it should be translated is the organ of pissing. The use of gutter language here is deliberate, See, one of the things that connects Joyce and Hegel is that they're both very careful in their use of language, and they both like playing games with their languages. Das in der Vorstellung bleibende Bewusstsein verhält sich zum Geist, wie das Organ des Pissen zum Organ des Säugens. It's obvious how das Organ des Pissens should be translated, but for some reason they translate it as organ of urination. Anyway, I've got that off my chest now. Objections may also be raised concerning the translations, conjunction and combines. For the consciousness remaining in the Vorstellung relates to the spirit and the depth which spirit pushes out of its interior, a process that is indeed going on throughout the wake, proceeds only as far as its Vorstellendes consciousness, and then it leaves it staying there. The unknowingness of this consciousness of what this is and what it is saying is the same kind of entanglement of the high and the low which nature, with regard to the sphere of living, naively expresses in the entanglement of the organ of its highest perfection, the organ of siring and the organ of pissing. Consciousness remaining in pre-presentation, in der Vorstellung, behaves like pissing, or consciousness remaining in the Vorstellung relates to the spirit like the organ of pissing to the organ for siring. Neither picture thinking nor representation adequately renders the point being made here. That would rather be pre-presentation. But in this particular instance, that is not the term of interest, that is urination. The representational aspects of the wake can be studied and enjoyed at a mimetic level, a glorious symphony of sound. As Richard Ellman has pointed out, Joyce endeavoured to render the Anna Livia Pluribel chapter as mimicking the sounds of a river, and while in Paris would listen to the sound of the Seine to check for the particular correspondence between fact and a product of the creative imagination. Viendes now sen I or Erewhon, Lasso Waterhouse's clock. They took it asunder, I heard them sigh. When will they resemble it? I may put some explanations of these Finnegans Wake quotations in the description. The intensely sensitive presence of Joy's earlier work thus becomes sensitive. So the objective world is represented as it is experienced from the perspective of an individual self-consciousness with its own recollections. Joyce thereto, aspiring towards a fidelity of fact to fact, whilst at once looking outwards and inwards, and the quest for objectivity then becomes an investigation into subjectivity and into their interaction, just as philosophy, as understood by Hegel, has to grasp and to express subjectivity. Complications ensue, given that the objective world is represented as it is experienced while distorted through the medium of an individual consciousness. But let us suppose the meaning of things were identified with organs of the body, as they are in the pseudosciences of phrenology and physiognomy, which Hegel does actually discuss at length, but not to support them. He doesn't agree with them. They are pseudosciences. The grey matter that is in our skulls is the seat of spirit that can be grasped either representationally or notionally, but nothing can ever be spoken about from a purely interior perspective. The essence of something has to put in an appearance and make itself explicit. And in thinking upon the living and the non-living, a decision has to be made between representational and notional thinking. Philosophical and scientific movements, as well as individual thinkers, are known to align themselves with the former, but what transpires thereby is reason discovering itself in opposition to the thing reasoned about. This is what representational thinking is, with its contradictions and its antitheses. The penis, for instance, serves a double function, the highest being that of siring, the lowest being that of eliminating body waste. At the level of representational thinking, one cannot make sense of it. The penis is represented but not grasped notionally. It cannot be understood how the high and the low are combined in the same thing in a way that is rational and makes sense. So, according to Hegel, for a judgment to remain at the level of representational thinking, its behaviour is akin to pissing, literally pissing things away, pissing about, of no value, without some kind of sublation to the level of notional thinking, a new and higher form of spirit. As Claviter said, the word for Joyce has the same power of negation as the Hegelian concept, the negation of the not I. But here we come across something of a stumbling block in our Hegelian reading of the Wake, and I give a quotation from the Science of Logic here. To sublate and being sublated, the idealized constitute one of the most important concepts of philosophy. The German Aufheben has a twofold meaning in the language. It equally means to keep, to preserve, and to cause to cease, to put an end to. That which is sublated is thus something at the same time preserved, something that has lost its immediacy but has not come to nothing for that. These two definitions of to sublate can be cited as two dictionary meanings of the word, but it must strike one as remarkable that a language has come to use one and the same word for two opposite meanings. For speculative thought, it is gratifying to find words that have in themselves a speculative meaning. So, the stumbling block is not the concept of sublation, which is a relatively straightforward matter, but the issue of whether and to what extent Hegelian philosophy is determined by the peculiarities of the German language. The peculiarities of the German language determine Hegelian philosophy. So, the logic of representation is inadequate for what is being described here. Instead, the notion leads the way in order for the dynamism of spirit to apprehend the dynamism of the subject. An Hegelian method of description of the recollection of spiritual forms as described in the Phenomenology, whereby the experience consciousness has of itself and of its objects is scrutinized with the purpose of bringing forth the contradictions and the effectively active movement that come to light in observing this experience. Hegel uses the phrase pure looking at to describe this method. As he says in the Phenomenology, but not only is a contribution by us superfluous, since notion and object, the criterion of what is to be tested, are present in consciousness itself, but we are also spared the trouble of comparing the two and really testing them, so that since what consciousness examines is its own self, all that is left for us to do is simply to look on. For Hegel, philosophizing is passive. As he says in the Encyclopedia Logic, philosophical thinking proceeds analytically in that it simply takes up its object, the idea, and lets it go its own way, while it simply watches the movement and development of it, so to speak. To this extent, philosophizing is wholly passive, but we must beware of our own inventions and particular opinions, which are forever wanting to push themselves forward. Consciousness attends closely to what is in fact present in itself and in its relations to its objects, and then it will come to see that what appears to be settled and enduring forms become undone through a dialectical movement. Rather than setting out arguments grounded upon a stream of deductive reasoning, actual consciousness is observed as it really is, and knowing is examined as it occurs in knowledge processes. The object of study is the successive appearances of the mind to itself, as each one is a more inclusive and uniform form of mind. As for symbols, on the other hand, they simply get in the way. They depend upon convention and are not showing us what a thing in itself is. They are standing in the place of or in the way of a thing that we want to understand. And I quote from the Phenomenology, but since the individual is at the same time only what he has done, his body is also the expression of himself, which he has himself produced. It is at the same time a sign which has not remained an immediate fact, but something through which the individual only makes known what he really is when he sets his original nature to work. So, the disciplines of physiognomy and phrenology present themselves as giving us something grounded in observation of reality, which is supposed to tell us about the phenomenon, in this case the body, that reveals to us the truth, the intelligibility of the phenomenon, but in reality it turns out that these are merely fortuitously connected. Pseudosciences are very much worse than no scientific pretensions at all, in virtue of their standing in the way of genuine scientific progress. The human subject understanding its own position as involved in the scientific project itself. Therefore, with an ascension to notional thinking and leaving picture thinking behind, one can avoid pissing about. Hegel's point behind this use of gutter language, by the way, it characterizes much of philosophy as practiced through picture thinking. Excuse my spelling mistake. In fact, excuse my mistakes. But as James Joyce said, a genius never makes mistakes. They are portals to the way of discovery. Well, I can't remember. It's in Ulysses anyway, you can look it up. Picture thinking is implied in this use of the phrase organ of pissing. This pissing about, that characterises much of the study to date of the Wake's language and aesthetic sensibilities. I'm about to get to some pissing about soon, actually, with Jacques Derrida. It sounds and its sense acting out the weight of a heavily laden memory as seen through the lens of Hegelian aesthetics itself. Joyce's aesthetics as Hegelian has been proposed by Jacques Aubert in the Aesthetics of James Joyce, on the assumption that the primary source for his aesthetic was Bernard Bosanquet, Neo-Hegelian, a history of, this is just details in case you're wondering where Joyce gets his, if there's any, if because I'm not really interested in Hegel's aesthetics having influence on the Wake, but there may be some. Robert Baines, Hegel and Wagner, in James Joyce's Drama and Life, has argued that Joyce shows evidence of Hegelian influence in a view of drama expounded in his Ecce Homo that may have derived from Hegel's aesthetics. Hegelian aesthetics, in a nutshell, is the aesthetic ideal, is the expression of human and spiritual freedom. 38. So, Hegelian, right, it characterises studies of the Wake that pissing about, that is, that focus upon the symbols with which the Wake abounds, seeing in them an embodiment of the Hegelian notion, albeit in a cultural form, and thereby returning thought and language to its primitive origins, and thus serving as a collective cultural memory. Donald Verren's book, Knowledge of Things Human and Divine. Vico's New Science and Finnegans Wake. I will get on to Vico later. He's a very important philosopher to the Wake. But for now, I'll just summarise. Verren's book is very good. I'll summarise some of the ideas. It may well be inconceivable for one person to integrate in a comprehensive manner the extensive body of details and the interrelations, all of the references, all of the connections, all of the symbolic, cultural and mythical connotations, all of the associated universal notions and collectively inherited thought patterns and imagery upon which the Wake is grounded. Neither is it feasible nor especially productive to deeply immerse oneself in the entire corpus of exegesis and criticism that has accrued to date on the subject of Joycean prose, much of which engages with the Wake as though it were an extensive, albeit sophisticated, logoglyph, a work of fiction to be anatomized, morpheme by morpheme, phoneme by phoneme, and yet such characterizes much of the Joycean critical work that has been undertaken for many years, and which is not my approach. It characterizes genetic criticism. This is like from Sam Sloat, who's it's what they call genetic criticism, which empowers itself by having recourse to the archive of a text past. Now, I don't see the point of that myself, but whatever. The chief concern is not the final text, as if there could be such a thing, which there is actually, but anyway, oh, never mind. But the reconstruction and analysis of the writing process itself, Geneticists find endless richness in what they call the avant text, a critical gathering of a writer's notes, sketches, drafts, manuscripts, typescripts, proofs and correspondence. For instance, and this is Sam Sloat speaking, when River Run was first added, River Run's the first word. You will know that because the Wake probably has the most famous opening sentence in literature, and that's about as far as people get. When River Run was first added, it appeared as two words, river and run, which would mess up my theory of bringing in River Run as suggesting Erinen, German from memory, which is important to Hegel. The words remain separate in the next draft level, the first typescript, although there was an indication that the words should be joined in the duplicate typescript. Joyce indicated that his word is to be capitalized, although this orthography was not retained. This excursion through the genetic archive testifies on behalf of the first apparent reading of River Run as a subject and a verb. So, genetic criticism, discovering, compiling, classifying data, like a science, searching for hidden causes behind the phenomena from a wealth of empirical detail, without much understanding of what the phenomena mean. It characterizes endeavors to deconstruct. And here we get onto Derrida, if I must. Although he mainly wrote about Ulysses. The irrepressible energy of Joycean textuality is not pure abandon, sheer play and gamble, but a structured movement of acquisition, an accumulative ingathering, encircling, encyclopedic movement which attempts to summarize the infinite memory of humanity. What is going on in Ulysses is to be compared to Hegelian Erinnerung, so at least we agree on that. Inwardly appropriating and making one's own the entirety of the preceding historical process, not by way of lifting it up, aufheben, vertically into an ingathering, spiralizing concept, begriff, as in Hegel's logic, but let us say by way of releasing horizontally the infinitely associative power of signifiers to link onto other signifiers across an endless surface of language. Were one to follow every link in this Joycean project of acquisition, were one to release every association, eventually, had one world enough and time, in principle at least, it is an ideal and an infinite task. One would traverse the whole and return home again, like Ulysses. Derrida therefore espouses the absolute antithesis of what I am about. Deconstruction, dissemination, they are the symptoms of an irrationality and loose ways of thinking instigated by an obsession with signifiers, symbols, or what in Derrida's case, how these symbols mean. This is all my opinion, and you are quite happy to give me some feedback in the comments. The very things which are, for Hegel, are getting in the way of the understanding. Derrida pisses about, making much out of phones, ringing all day long in Ulysses, supposedly suggesting a telecommunicational metaphor for the text network of signifiers, putative connections that are merely contingent. So, endeavours to deconstruct philosophy's supposed pretensions to a literature of truth, or criticism's pretensions to tell the truth about literature, treating language as haunted by, this is This is Derrida's thought, such as it is. Treating language as haunted by dispersal, absence, loss, the risk of unmeaning, the distinction between philosophy and literature as of secondary importance. Philosophy, it is asserted, endeavours in vain to control the irrecoverable dissemination of its own meaning, whatever that means. It strives, it is also asserted, against the grain of language to offer a sober revelation of truth. Literature, on the other hand, flaunts its own meretriciousness, abandons itself to the Dionysiac play of language. In his work Dissemination, Derrida joins in the revelry, weaving a complex pattern of puns, verbal echoes, and allusions, intending to deconstruct both the pretensions of criticism to tell the truth about literature and the pretension of philosophy to be the literature of truth. This is misguided on two counts. First, to do with language, the second to do with truth. Derrida, in his revelry, is attending the wrong party, the Bacchanalian revelry. For those who've read the Phenomenology, you know what the Bacchanalian revelry is. Hegel says truth is like a Bacchanalian revelry in which well, I can't remember the exact quote. No memory is not drunk, but I will get onto that later. I was just making a little joke there at Derrida's expense. Where was I? The distinction is rather of primary importance, however, the distinction between literature and philosophy. And the particular use of language in the Wake can be studied from the perspective of the means by which it restores to the reader an experience of the language of forms of spirit. By following through necessary connections and allusions in the Wake, it can be seen that the network of recollections in Hegel's Phenomenology has its analogue in the Wake, as the latter presents a characterization of recollection as imaginatively reconstructed recurrences in the circular development of history, both cultural and of the individual. Images certainly play a role in an initial intuition when they are interiorized, while by means of a process of abstraction they discover their own subjective position, both spatially and temporally, in the intelligence. The Wake is rich with instances of the threefold process by which imagination reproduces and reconstructs the image, and recollection is an imaginative reconstruction that is successfully reproductive, associative, and creative. The latter leading to the end goal of this inquiry, the recollection of imageless, non-representational forms of spirit. To be continued. I apologize again for my stumbling. But look up in Ulysses when he's actually referring to Shakespeare. Not that I want to compare myself to Shakespeare. When he says a genius makes no mistakes. But anyway, I shall end for now. Thank you for listening and watching.